Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Giving and receiving feedback at the office are critical. Unfortunately, there are a number of issues that we can think of when we consider giving and receiving feedback on both sides. Oftentimes, it is something that is met with mixed emotions and mixed opinions. There's no denying the fact that regular and proper feedback can be an important part of personal and professional growth and development for an individual within the organization. That's only one of the things that makes it so important as part of the workplace experience. It's no surprise then that considering its mixed reviews, giving and receiving feedback does come with some challenges. One of the biggest problems is that this is something that is not done on a regular basis. Many organizations engage in an annual review where giving and receiving feedback is encouraged or part of the process. Some may even do it twice a year, but in reality, that may not be as frequent as may be most beneficial for the employee and its organization. And of course, there are plenty of organizations where giving and receiving feedback is simply not on anyone's schedule, but rather is done fairly haphazardly. Part of that irregularity when it comes to feedback can be linked to the organization's culture. When an organization has a strong culture in place, one that values, highlights, and promotes feedback as part of the everyday experience, giving and receiving feedback in a formal way is often not an issue. But the reality is that many organizations and their cultures are lacking in this department. When we think about feedback or formal reviews at the workplace, all too often the ideas of criticism and judgment or some kind of grading and evaluation come up rather than it being a two-way conversation where the purpose and the point would be not only to exchange ideas but to learn and create a plan of action that will help to improve both the individual, their experience, and the organization as a whole. Something else to consider, especially for those types of feedback events which may only happen once or twice a year, is timing. Timing can be critical when addressing specific issues. If we attempt to address a specific issue that happened 6 months ago or more, it may be that much more difficult to make that connection and make the point with whatever feedback is being prepared. So timing can also be key to successful feedback. Sometimes managers may simply not enjoy giving feedback. Maybe it's because they avoid conflict as part of their nature. Perhaps they feel uncomfortable or unprepared in how to offer constructive feedback, promoting growth and forward movement for both the employee and the organization. So instead, they may resort to socially acceptable feedback or strictly positive feedback. In addition to potentially lacking the skills necessary to provide feedback that is effective and well received, lack of communication may also be an issue. Inadequate communication skills can be problematic in any situation, but when combined with a potentially stressful and definitely meaningful situation such as a feedback session, poor communications can become even that much more detrimental. Many of the approaches to feedback may be lacking in a specific or detailed plan for improvement. After all, good feedback will not rely on simply telling the employee what they are doing right and what they are doing wrong, but rather it will come together with the employee in a manner that will allow the employee and the organization to benefit and move forward. All too often, feedback is associated with criticism, whether that's on the part of the person providing the feedback or the person receiving the feedback. If somewhere deep down you associate feedback as criticism, it can take on a whole different meaning and change the entire experience for everyone involved. If feedback is seen as some form of criticism, then criticism in itself, or this perceived criticism, can now turn into a threat of sorts. Is it any wonder that people may be dreading giving and receiving feedback if it is associated with criticism and therefore seen as a form of threat? Interestingly enough, studies tell us that criticism is often much more likely to be remembered than something such as praise. Unfortunately, the other part of that reality has been that while criticism is well remembered or frequently remembered or more likely remembered, it is also more likely to be remembered incorrectly. So if we put all of that together and think about feedback, which may or may not be done well, may or may not be done in a timely fashion and on a regular basis, may not be done skillfully, it can easily be misunderstood as criticism and therefore as a threat. That's one potential explanation of why both the feedback giver and receiver may absolutely dread the entire experience. As we look at some of the best practices associated with feedback that benefits the person giving it and the person receiving it, all we have to do is go through that list of challenges that I just presented and work on those. In other words, make sure that it is done on a regular basis, that it is timely and relevant, that the people giving the feedback have the proper training and have the ability to communicate properly and effectively. And of course, make sure that you have a plan of action. You cannot simply provide feedback to an employee without offering anything beyond that in order to perhaps improve the situation or fix an existing problem. Of course, it's also important to remember that feedback should be purposeful. Feedback for the sake of feedback, such as may be the case when an organization is simply looking to check off a box of what they need to accomplish that year or that 6-month period, will likely be much less effective. So focusing on feedback that has a purpose is always a good idea. It's important to focus on specific problems, specific accomplishments, specific strengths and weaknesses. That's what's going to help us to come up with a specific plan of action to move things in the right direction. It's also important not to get hung up on personality traits and generalities. A good feedback session should be one that promotes a conversation between the person giving the feedback and the person receiving it. It should be a two-way conversation that promotes questions and comments from both sides. At the end of the feedback session, both parties should walk away with a good understanding of what was discussed, what was conveyed, and what needs to happen in the future, and of course, how it will happen in the future. Many of you have heard of the sandwich method of feedback. There have been some mixed reviews over the years, but if you haven't heard about this approach, it's basically sandwiching any kind of feedback or suggestion between two positive statements or two positive events. Of course, there's much to be said for how feedback is received, regardless of how well it is given. It's always important to be gracious when receiving feedback. Pay attention to what is being said. Don't interrupt when the person giving you feedback is talking, and pay attention in a way that will allow you to ask questions for clarification as needed. Stay open-minded and avoid being defensive as much as possible. Skipping on those two things can really lead into trouble. Keep in mind that feedback is there for a reason. It's not simply something that allows an employer to grade you and your performance. It is also an opportunity for productive dialogue and advancement in your career and potentially within the company. In other words, it's an opportunity for growth and development. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Giving and receiving feedback is an important part of the workplace experience. Unfortunately, it can be challenging for many. Challenges may range from simply not providing feedback frequently or regularly enough to not providing it in a timely and therefore regular manner, to treating it as criticism, which can then be understood or interpreted as a threat. Giving feedback, as important as it is, should not be taken lightly and should be reserved for those with the skills to tackle that challenge. It's important that feedback be purposeful and that it focuses on things that can be addressed and changed rather than on things such as personality traits. Feedback is definitely an opportunity for personal growth, so it is something that should be embraced by the individual employee, but also by the organization. As the week unfolds, I encourage you to consider your own feedback practices, whether you are someone who gives or who receives feedback. How do you handle it? How purposeful and effective is that feedback? And what is your role or your response in feedback? For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I invite you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G, which contains the video versions of this podcast. In addition to the video versions of the podcast, my YouTube channel also contains videos that focus on stress management. So I encourage you to check it out. It's Stress Free with Dr. G on YouTube, and the link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.